Hi, I'm Stephen with AlbertaUrbanGarden.ca. The core goal of the Urban Gardening series is to show you how to grow more food at home. Often, in urban gardens, patios, decks, and balconies, space can be limited. So on today's episode, I'm going to show you the 10 ways that I optimize how much I can grow even in my limited garden space. The first way to increase the amount of produce that you make within your garden area without expanding is to take advantage of space that's not being used. In traditional gardening, the vertical space is not well used. So, by growing vertically, you can drastically improve the amount of produce you're able to produce. I use a variety of trellises to take advantage of the vertical space in my garden. Trellises are basically anything that can support a plant vertically. Things like fences make a great trellis or support to build one on. I have grapes growing on my garden fence, and I've also built a permanent trellis off of my back fence to hold the rest of my grapevines. More simplistically, you can use things like bamboo to support annuals such as tomatoes and melons. An easy middle ground to start with is an electrical conduit trellis. They are easy to install and relatively inexpensive to make. I grow a number of vining crops up them every year, and I train some of my tomatoes up it as well. Growing some crops vertically allows you to plant other crops in much closer proximity. For instance, tomatoes when left alone can take up over a square meter or 3+ square feet. When grown with a trellis, paired with some pruning, I can plant them one plant per 30 square centimeters or 1 square foot. This increases the amount of produce per square foot I am able to grow. After training my family heirloom grapes up this trellis, it freed up a lot of space below. And similar to tomatoes, what this means is I can plant other crops in closer proximity. For instance, I've chosen to use a ground cover that will produce food for me as well. I have found a few perennial pairs that do quite well together. The most important factor for perennials that you are planting in close proximity is the pH of the soil. For instance, grapes do best in a soil pH of 5.5 to 7.0, and strawberries grow best in a similar pH range of 5.5 to 6.5. Their growth patterns are also matched quite well. The grapes climb the trellis and the strawberries stay within 30 centimeters or 1 foot of the soil, providing a food-producing ground cover. Another great pairing is blueberries and lingonberries. Blueberries do best in an acidic soil with a pH range of 4.5 to 5.5, and the lingonberries like an almost identical pH range of 4.3 to 5.5. The plants are complementary, as my low bush blueberry should grow to roughly 1 meter or 3.2 feet tall and wide, and the lingonberries should get between 30 centimeters or 1 foot tall and wide. Both strawberries and lingonberries in the wild grow as ground cover under the canopy of a forest. As such, they do well in close proximity with other plants in partial shade. I've touched on planting these vertically grown crops much closer together. However, high-density planting extends past just these vertically grown crops. I plant most of my crops in a high-density method inspired by the Square Foot Gardening book. Planting crops in high densities allows you to grow more than, say, a traditional row garden. That said, I have had to learn over the years how much space each plant actually needs and how close I can plant them. Instead of planting my onions in rows that are 30 centimeters to 45 centimeters apart or 12 to 18 inches, with plant spacing of roughly 15 centimeters or 8 inches, I plant 16 plants per square foot or square 30 centimeters. The overall size of bulbs will be lower, however, the weight of crops per square foot in the garden will be much higher. Planting densely is a wonderful way to increase the amount of production. However, the variety itself is very important. Working with varieties that are well acclimated to your zone can greatly improve your chances at producing a heavy crop every year. I grow hardy grapes and blueberries that produce bountiful amounts of smaller fruit than their southern counterparts. If I did try to grow a vine or a bush that was not hardy to my zone, it may produce larger fruit, however, much smaller quantities, if at all. You can usually find native crops or well-suited ones to your location at locally owned greenhouses. As you begin to harvest some crops, space is freed up within your garden that you can replant, often within the same season. This is called succession planting. There are plenty of crops, such as radishes and carrots, that grow quickly and can be harvested and replanted. Succession planting is a great way to double or even triple your harvests in the same area throughout the same season. Another method of successive planting I featured in a recent episode is where I showed how I double the potatoes per bag, essentially doubling my harvest in the same area. Compost is an essential part of my garden. It allows me to take free and local resources that would otherwise be headed to landfill and turn them into plant available food. Unfortunately, even in my small organic garden, it does require quite a bit of compost in order to allow me to avoid the purchase of store-bought fertilizers. As such, I produce compost in my garden area, but this is not wasted space. Over the winter, I pile compost materials on top of my hot compost that I made in the fall. This leaves undecomposed material in the spring. As soon as I can work the pile, I spread it out, helping to get some of the hot decomposition underway. I like to do this well before the planting season, as excess heat can reduce germination. I cover the piles with autumn leaves that acts like a biofilter, helping to keep any smells from wafting over to my neighbors. When it's time to plant, I take some potting soil and make a nest and plant crops such as squash, zucchini, and melons. As organic matter breaks down in the compost, it locks up nutrients such as nitrogen, releasing it later when the compost is finished. My native earthworms and the red wigglers that have successfully overwintered in my garden will help speed the process along. Now, normally, I would not recommend planting in unfinished compost, as inevitably, your plants will require those nutrients that are locked up during the growing season. That said, by the time the squash get in there, they are able to find the nutrients they need while the compost finishes off during the year. Not only by the end of the season do I have a wonderfully nutrient-rich compost that I can use to further build the soil in my garden, I don't lose any space and I'm able to produce crops for my family, further increasing my garden yields. Now that we've optimized the growth within the raised beds, it's time to think outside the garden box. Containers are a great way to take advantage of underutilized space, such as pathways or corners. And it's also a great way to control plants that may become invasive, such as horseradish or mint. Containers can be placed in spaces that are not being used and later moved as the garden fills out. I grow a wide variety of perennials, such as blueberries, figs, goji berries, grapes, and mint, and annuals, such as herbs and leafy greens. I often move the containers around throughout the season to take advantage of underutilized space in my garden. Further to underutilized space, containers let those who have limited space, such as decks, patios, or balconies, grow more food at home as well. Whether you're growing in raised beds or containers, high-producing crops is another way that you can optimize how much produce you're making in your garden. High-producing crops are varieties that produce more over the course of the season by weight than some of the other varieties of the same crop. The best example of this in my garden is tomatoes and strawberries. The overall size of cherry tomatoes is dwarfed by some of the larger varieties like pink brandywines. With that in mind, throughout the season, especially indeterminate cherry tomatoes can produce an overall larger harvest, often available over a longer period of time. Another great example of a crop that produces more over the course of a season is day-neutral or ever-bearing varieties. Selecting varieties that produce overall larger quantities of harvest increases the efficiency of the plants in your garden, allowing you to grow more food in the same space. Thinking a little bigger picture, urban lawns are a great opportunity to expand how much you can produce in your yard. Now, I'm unlikely to expand my annual garden for the time being, as my son still uses the backyard and plays quite a bit out here. However, I have used it in order to increase the amount of fruit-producing perennials that I have available. I have planted 2 dwarf and 1 espalier apple tree and a pear tree to go along with my 5 fruit-producing bushes. They can be integrated well into my yard without getting in the way of my son's use and still produce crops for myself and my family. Often, plants like apple trees require cross-pollination. A space-saving method to increase the pollination is to graft another variety to the same tree. This Manitoba apple I grafted this spring will flower next year and not only produce its own apples, but help to improve the pollination of the Harcourt apple it's grafted to. Although not related to your own yard, public planting is a great way to increase the number of varieties of perennials that you have access to. I received the appropriate permissions in order to plant out here, this Mount Royal plum, these honeyberries, and that Romeo cherry over there. Planting these varieties in public spaces not only allows the kids to have a healthy snack while playing outside, it helps them learn about where their food comes from, and the extra produce can be shared within the community. If you have any tips for producing more food using the same space, I would love to hear it in the comments section below. If you would like to catch up on the urban gardening series, check out the link on screen now, and make sure to subscribe so you can watch all future episodes.